finished your PhD, Ellen, what did you do? Perhaps you could talk us through the different stages of your career.
Okay, so I was finishing up my PhD, but I hadn't quite finished it, and I wasn't quite ready to submit it. And I think I was secretly terrified because I was used to the idea of having a defense where you could actually argue with people. So the thought that I was going to hand this document over at La Trobe and it was going to go off to people and they got to decide and I didn't get to argue, and really your supervisor doesn't get to argue, it was a bit intimidating to me. So maybe I was delaying a bit at the end. So I really wanted to stay in Australia. I applied for a job at the University of Adelaide and I was super thrilled by that, but some other nice person got that job. And the people at the University of Guelph, and this is something I don't think was a good thing, but anyway, asked me to interview for a job at Guelph, so I did. And I went back to Guelph. And I finished my PhD thesis after I got there. I submitted it about 6 months after I got there, and that also was a mistake because it made the first year
Really tough.
really difficult.
Yeah.
But I think I was the first female hired in the entire faculty of agriculture, which is probably over 150 faculty in those days. I was certainly the first woman in the department. They did hire another man at the same time I was hired, but there hadn't been anybody else hired for about 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And because I'd been a student there, I had friendships with a lot of the support staff in the department. And it was support staff female and faculty male, and entrenched patterns of behavior. So just as an example, the women sat in this part of the lunchroom and talked and knitted and did things, and the men sat in this part of the lunchroom and played bridge.
Right.
So every second day I sat with the other group.
Wow.
Because I couldn't figure out how, and so they kind of got used to it.
Yeah.
It was totally fascinating because you would ask the support staff about how do I go about booking travel, or how do I go about putting in an expense account, or where's the office for this, and they would say, you can find it if you look on your phone directory here, or the paperwork's down on the second floor in that office, whereas the men were having coffee carried into their offices. And so it was really surreal.
Yeah.
And for them too, eventually they realized it was pretty surreal as well. So we laugh about, I still know some of them, so we laugh about it now, but it was very formal structure. I also can remember that eventually I applied to go on maternity leave and they said, no. And I said, well, I'm actually having the baby and the country says I can have maternity leave. And they said, oh, no. And none of them had a connection with maternity leave through their family or anything, or been in charge of anybody who'd gone on maternity leave. They literally thought it was optional. Many of them were American, and it still is not quite as established in the States as it is. So I had to have a fight to actually, because they kept saying, no, you will be teaching, you know.
Oh my God.
And I was running the graduate program, and they actually brought the files to the hospital because they couldn't remember what I wanted done with the files. And anyway, it was a mess. The nurses said, you don't bring files to a hospital when somebody, anyway. It was bizarre. It was.
Guelph, how long were you there?
I was at Guelph, so I started at Guelph in 1983, and I stayed effectively till 1997. But I will say,
Time. I didn't realize you were there for that long.
yeah, I didn't ever completely give up my Australian connections.
Mm-hmm.
There were people I met here who were super helpful to me, and arranged for me to have some visiting appointments at the World Bank, where I worked for Dr. Ron Duncan.
Ron was there? Okay.
Yes, he was very patient with me, shall we say, in lots of ways.
Yeah.
And I think that saved me, because every so often I went off for a couple of months and was in a different environment, and I didn't feel so squashed.
Okay, that's great.
But I will also say that I had nobody to talk to about this whole publishing process at the very beginning.
Right.
So I'm sitting there and you put an article, what do you know about putting an article into a journal? And I put an article into a journal and it came back and they said, this is crap, essentially.
So you always do.
And so I threw it out. I never looked at it again. I never had anybody to even ask what you do about those things. Eventually I started,
Mentoring of any sort.
no, I started talking back then to people in Australia who said, no, that's not what you do. But no, it was a really, really difficult environment. But I loved teaching
Yeah.
in the end. I mean, I think the first year I went home in tears after every lecture.
It's hard that first year.
But after that, I loved it.
Yeah.
And I could get the students arguing. And I found out that, you know, what I'd learned here is that you have to be able to apply what you're teaching. You have to make it live somehow. There have to be real stories. And so I always had a lot of dairy farmer students, and so I would use some of my pure economic theory to say what a dreadful thing supply management was. And I could always get at least two of them to stand up and say, have you thought about the human capital gain from us being able to afford to go to university? Because we're the first in our generation and we wouldn't be here if we were not. And you could then humanize the story and say what some of the benefits
Fantastic.
are.